She was the daughter of a scandalous marriage, declared illegitimate, imprisoned, threatened, and yet she rose to become one of the most iconic monarchs in English history. This is the story of Elizabeth I, the Virgin Queen, the last Tudor, and the woman who shaped the future of England. Elizabeth Tudor was born on September the 7th, 1533, at Greenwich Palace in London. Her birth was a deep disappointment to her father, King Henry VIII, who desperately wanted a male heir to secure the Tudor dynasty. Her mother, Anne Boleyn, was Henry's second wife, and she had risen from the position of lady-in-waiting to queen consort, largely due to Henry's obsession with producing a son. Anne's failure to produce a male heir, combined with court intrigue and religious opposition, led to her downfall. In 1536, she was executed on trumped-up charges of adultery, incest, and high treason. Elizabeth, not yet 3 years old, was declared illegitimate and removed from the line of succession. Despite this trauma, Elizabeth's education was exceptionally rigorous. Under the guidance of scholars such as Roger Ascham and William Grindal, she received a humanist education rooted in the classics. By her teens, she was fluent in Latin and Greek, spoke French and Italian with ease, and had a strong grasp of theology, rhetoric, and history. Her intelligence and wit quickly became apparent to those at court. However, her position was precarious, as her half-siblings Edward VI and Mary I took the throne in succession. Elizabeth had to navigate the dangerous tides of court politics. Under Mary's reign, Elizabeth was implicated in the Wyatt Rebellion of 1554, a Protestant uprising against the Catholic Queen's planned marriage to Philip of Spain. Though evidence was scant against Elizabeth, she was still imprisoned in the Tower of London. The experience would leave a lasting impression on Elizabeth, one that would shape her cautious, calculated approach to power. However, on November 17th, 1558, Queen Mary I died, and she died childless. England was exhausted by religious persecution, and it was wary of Spanish dominance, and so it looked to Elizabeth with a mix of hope and uncertainty. At the age of just 25 years old, Elizabeth became Queen of England, an occasion that no one had ever thought possible. Her coronation, held on January the 15th, 1559, was a masterclass in symbolism. The festivities began the day before the coronation with a grand procession through London streets. Elizabeth, dressed in resplendent robes of gold cloth and seated beneath a lavish canopy, was paraded from the Tower of London to Westminster. Crowds lined the streets, cheering and tossing flowers, eager to glimpse the young queen who symbolised a new beginning. The route was decorated with triumphal arches and pageants, each rich with allegory, scenes of harmony, justice, and divine favour. The first arch was at Gracechurch Street, and this was 3 stories tall and was labelled the uniting of 2 houses of Lancaster and York, upon which was a huge representation of a rose bush, on which were large statues of Henry VII, Elizabeth of York, Henry VIII, and Anne Boleyn, with Elizabeth seated in majesty at the very top, pointedly underlining the legitimacy of her succession. And interestingly, she had put her mother back into that succession. And in another tableau, Elizabeth was likened to Deborah, the biblical judge and leader, underscoring her destined role as a wise and godly ruler. The following day, the coronation ceremony was held at Westminster Abbey. Elizabeth was anointed with holy oil by the Bishop of Carlisle, one of the few senior clergy willing to serve a Protestant queen, and she was crowned with St. Edward's crown. She accepted the royal regalia, the orb, the sceptre, and the sword, each symbolising different aspects of her sovereignty. Although the service was Catholic in form, it was deliberately ambiguous in tone. Elizabeth understood the importance of unity at a time when England was deeply divided by faith. The careful blending of old and new created a coronation that reassured conservatives while signalling a shift towards reform. The grandeur of the event and Elizabeth's command of its stagecraft signalled the dawn of a new era. It was not merely a religious rite or political necessity. It was a theatrical assertion of her legitimacy, her connection to the people, and her divine right to rule. England at the time was a nation in turmoil, deeply divided by religious conflict, economically strained, and diplomatically isolated. Elizabeth's solution was moderation. She enacted the Elizabethan religious settlement, re-establishing the Church of England and instituting a moderate form of Protestantism. While it alienated some extremists on both sides, it largely brought a sense of relative stability to a fractured country. Her political acumen was evident in her choice of advisers. Chief among them was William Cecil, later Lord Burleigh, who served her loyally for decades. Together, they built a government that prioritised intelligence, diplomacy, and caution, a government that could outmaneuver larger, more powerful foes. Throughout her reign, Elizabeth understood the power of image. She constructed a public persona of strength, wisdom, and virginity, a queen above earthly desires. Artists were commissioned to paint her with symbols of purity, imperial power, and divine providence pearls, suns, globes, and roses. These images helped forge the myth of Gloriana, a queen chosen by God and wedded to her nation. Her fashion was as deliberate as her politics. Elizabeth's elaborate gowns, often encrusted with jewels and embroidered with symbolic motifs, projected magnificence and authority. Her signature ruffled collars, powdered white face, and fiery red wigs became iconic. These elements were carefully curated to emphasize her regal status and her timeless beauty, even as she aged. And her refusal to marry became a central element of her reign. Though many suitors were, of course, considered, including Philip II of Spain, Archduke Charles of Austria, and the French Duke of Anjou, Elizabeth ultimately chose sovereignty over partnership. Marriage, she believed, would compromise her authority and entangle England in foreign alliances, just as she had seen happen to her sister Mary. She famously declared, "I am already bound unto a husband, which is the kingdom of England." Her decision to remain single earned her the title of the Virgin Queen, a symbol of self sacrifice and devotion to duty. In a time when queens were expected to marry and produce heirs, Elizabeth redefined rulership on her own terms. Her celibacy became political theatre, reinforcing her mythic image and giving her unparalleled independence. She cultivated adoration at court, surrounding herself with favourites such as Robert Dudley, the Earl of Leicester, and later the dashing Robert Devereux, Earl of Essex. Though these relationships sparked rumours and controversy, Elizabeth never allowed her personal affections to override her political instincts. Throughout her reign, Elizabeth had to deal with enemies both at home and abroad. Elizabeth's England was a small, relatively poor nation surrounded by powerful Catholic monarchies. Spain, in particular, posed a constant threat. Within her own borders, Catholic plots simmered. Chief among them was Mary, Queen of Scots, a Catholic rival and legitimate heir in the eyes of many to the English throne. However, Mary fled to England after being deposed in Scotland and was kept under house arrest by Elizabeth for 19 years. Over time, she became the focus of various conspiracies to dethrone Elizabeth and put Mary in her place. Francis Walsingham, Elizabeth's spy master, built an extensive intelligence network to uncover and disrupt these plots. His agents uncovered the Babington Plot of 1586, a plan to assassinate Elizabeth and put Mary on the throne. With evidence in hand, Elizabeth reluctantly signed Mary's death warrant. Mary was executed in 1587 at Fotheringhay Castle, a move that absolutely shocked Europe, but removed a dangerous threat in Elizabeth's eyes. In retaliation, Philip II of Spain launched the Spanish Armada in 1588. Over 130 ships sailed towards England, intending to conquer and restore Catholic rule. But the English navy, led by figures like Sir Francis Drake and Lord Howard, used fireships and superior manoeuvring to disrupt the Spanish formation. Storms called the Protestant wind did the rest. The Armada was defeated and England celebrated a providential victory. Before the invasion, Elizabeth had delivered one of her most iconic speeches at Tilbury to rally her troops, and in it she said, "I know I have the body but of a weak and feeble woman, but I have the heart and stomach of a king, and of a king of England too." Her presence at Tilbury in armour, surrounded by soldiers, bolstered national pride, and it immortalised her as a warrior queen. This moment became a defining symbol of her leadership and determination. The defeat of the Armada marked the height of Elizabeth's power. At home, Elizabeth encouraged a cultural renaissance. Elizabeth herself was a gifted linguist, poet, and musician. She played the lute and the virginals and composed occasional verse. But more importantly, she understood that the flourishing of culture was a reflection of a nation's strength and sophistication. She became a powerful patron of the arts, supporting playwrights, musicians, and artists. Her court was filled with poets and intellectuals drawn by both her prestige and the possibility of royal favour. William Shakespeare, while not directly patronised by Elizabeth, thrived under her reign, writing plays that often resonated with themes of power, legitimacy, and national identity, ideas central to Elizabeth's own rule. Christopher Marlowe, Edmund Spenser, and John Lilly were also prominent voices of the era. Spenser's The Faerie Queen, an epic allegorical poem, was dedicated to Queen Elizabeth, and it cast her as the immortal Gloriana, a mythical figure embodying the ideal virtues of monarchy. Elizabeth also encouraged court masques, lavish theatrical performances combining poetry, music, dance, and elaborate costuming. These performances were not only entertainment, but political theatre, again reinforcing her image as a wise and almost divine ruler. The Queen's support extended beyond literature. She revived interest in English music, favouring composers like William Byrd and Thomas Tallis. Though Byrd was a Catholic, Elizabeth's tolerance of his genius reflected her pragmatism and her belief in excellence above dogma. Through her patronage, Elizabeth laid the groundwork for what would become a defining era in English culture. The richness of her court inspired generations of creativity and helped shape a national identity steeped in art, expression, and intellect. Meanwhile, English explorers began expanding the nation's reach. Sir Walter Raleigh founded the ill-fated Roanoke colony in North America, and Sir Francis Drake circumnavigated the globe. While true colonisation would come later, these ventures laid the groundwork for England's imperial ambitions. Elizabeth was cautious in her support of these overseas ventures. She was aware of the risks, but she allowed privateers to harass Spanish ships, filling English coffers and expanding naval experience. By the 1590s, Elizabeth's golden age began to fade. The economy faltered, bad harvests led to famine, unrest stirred among the lower classes. Her court became divided. Younger nobles like the ambitious Earl of Essex challenged her authority, and his failed rebellion in 1601 led to his execution, a painful moment for Elizabeth, who had once loved him dearly. Elizabeth also aged visibly. She took to wearing heavy makeup and wigs to maintain her image. Yet the sharp mind remained. She continued to govern diligently, holding long councils and demanding loyalty. Elizabeth died on March 24, 1603, at Richmond Palace. Her passing marked the end of the Tudor dynasty. With no children of her own, the crown passed to James VI of Scotland, uniting the English and Scottish thrones. Elizabeth I reigned for 44 years. Under her leadership, England was transformed from a troubled kingdom into a major European power. She brought stability after decades of turmoil and inspired a cultural movement that still resonates today. She proved that a woman could rule with wisdom, strength, and independence. Her political savvy, her flair for public image, and her deep love for her country made her one of the most revered monarchs in history. She left behind no heir, but her legacy is undeniable. And as a result, the Elizabethan age remains a golden chapter in the story of England.